All right, let's talk about something that's a huge deal for any software developer: design patterns. They're an incredibly powerful tool, for sure, but they can also be, let's be honest, a massive source of confusion. So, today we're going to demystify them and figure out how to actually use them the right way. We have all been here. You're staring at some really tricky code, a complicated mess of objects talking to each other, and that little voice in your head says, hey, there's got to be a pattern for this, right? Which one is it? It feels like the most logical question in the world. But, and this is the big but, it's not. In fact, starting with that question is probably the single biggest mistake you can make. It almost always leads to over-engineering, building these super complex solutions for simple problems, which then become a total nightmare to maintain for you and anyone else who joins the team. And this gets us to what I like to call the design pattern trap. It's that urge to go hunting for a pattern, any pattern, to slap onto your code instead of just, focusing on the problem you're actually trying to solve. You end up with a solution looking for a problem, which is completely backward. I love this metaphor because it's just so perfect. Imagine you have this huge ring full of keys. If you just grab one before you've even walked up to the door and looked at the lock, what are you doing? You're just guessing. You might get lucky, sure, but you're way more likely to waste a bunch of time or, worse, break the key off in the lock. It's the exact same thing with code. So, the big question is, how do we get out of this trap? Well, it all comes down to a really fundamental shift in how we think. We need to adopt a problem-first mindset. That just means we need to get a really, really deep understanding of the specific issue in front of us before we even let the word pattern enter our minds. And these are exactly the kinds of questions we should be asking. Instead of, which pattern should I use? Try asking, what am I actually trying to do here? Am I looking for more flexibility? Do I need to make this thing easier to reuse? Where do I think this code is going to have to change 6 months from now? Answering these questions shows you the shape of the lock. Okay, so once you've got a good handle on the what and the why of your problem, the next step is to categorize it. This is a huge help because it takes this giant universe of design patterns and narrows it down to a manageable size. Pretty much all of them fit into one of 3 main buckets. First up, you've got your creational patterns. Is your problem at its core about how objects are made? Maybe you've got some gnarly constructor logic, or you need to spit out different kinds of objects depending on some input. If that sounds familiar, you're in the creational zone. The classic example here is the factory pattern, which is perfect for cleaning up messy object creation logic. Then we have our second category, structural patterns. These guys are all about how you piece classes and objects together to build bigger, more complex structures. Is your problem about making 2 things that weren't designed to work together? Well, work together? That's a textbook case for the adapter pattern. It's all about composition and relationships. And finally, there are behavioral patterns. These are all about communication, how objects talk to each other, and who's responsible for what. If your problem is about how a request gets passed down a line of objects until one can handle it, or how an object needs to completely change its behavior based on its internal state, then you're dealing with a behavioral problem. The chain of responsibility is a perfect example of this in action. Okay, so you've defined your problem, you've put it into one of those 3 buckets, now what? Well, now it's finally time to start looking for a specific match. And one of the best ways to do this is to learn to spot the symptoms in your own code. The trick is to look for these reoccurring issues that we often call code smells. Now, code smell isn't a bug, not technically. It's just a part of the code that feels off. It's a little clumsy, a little hard to read. And those smells are fantastic clues that point you toward a better design. And this right here is where it gets really practical. This table is an amazing diagnostic tool. For example, do you see a gigantic if-else block whose only job is to create different kinds of objects? That's a huge smell that's basically screaming, use a factory pattern. Or how about a class that's just getting bigger and bigger with all these optional features being tacked on? The decorator pattern might be exactly what you need. This mapping from a smell to a pattern is how you find the right key for your lock. But hold on. Just because you found a match doesn't mean your job is done. You can't just apply it blindly. This brings us to a super important and honestly often skipped step, thinking in trade-offs. Because every single pattern you add introduces another layer of abstraction and complexity. So you have to stop and ask yourself this one simple but incredibly powerful question. Is adding this pattern actually going to make the code easier to understand in the long run, or am I just making things more complicated because I think I'm supposed to use a pattern here? Sometimes, believe it or not, the simplest solution with no fancy pattern is the right one. So let's just wrap this whole process into a clear 5-step guideline. 1. Define your problem and figure out where it needs to be flexible. 2. Categorize it. Is it about creation, structure, or behavior? 3. Match your specific situation, your code smell, to the intent of a pattern. 4, and this is the big one, check the trade-offs. And finally, 5, apply it, and then test it to make absolutely sure it actually fixed the problem you started with. And look, if you only take one single thing away from this, please let it be this. This quote captures the entire mindset shift we're talking about. You have to stop asking, which pattern, and start asking, what am I actually trying to achieve? So I'll leave you with this final thought to chew on. Think about a piece of code you're working on right now, maybe one that feels a bit messy or complicated. Instead of reaching for a pattern catalog, what would happen if you just started by asking a better question? Thanks for joining me.